1546, John Heywood wrote, "For the trees cannot be seen for the wood." Almost 500 years later, this is transformed into the much more commonly understood missing the forest for the trees. This idiom refers to what I feel is the innate human nature to focus on the specifics instead of the whole picture.
Regardless of what topic that I decide to make a video on, it often always boils down to some permutation or evolution of that aforementioned behavior.
We, as humans, like simple problems because simple problems are easy. Unfortunately for us, problems are often not simple. This is only magnified when we attempt to diagnose and assess phenomena in nature. Feynman said, "Nature uses only the longest threads to weave her patterns, so that each small piece of her fabric reveals the organization of the entire tapestry." Much like the rogue thread on a t-shirt, humanity pulls at these threads, expecting it to simply remove itself without much affair. But anyone who has done this knows that that thread pulls on the greater tapestry and system, and what once starts as a single loose thread cascades into seeming collapse of the entire structure.
One can find many examples of this through history in regards to nature. But I feel there's one specific example of this that still embattles and impassions people to this day. Here, in the Texas Hill Country, a war has raged for over 100 years. A war over the existence of a tree.
It's been called invasive, it's been demonized, it's often burned, like the proverbial witch at the stake. But that tree is, to me at least, a shining example of missing the forest for the trees. This is the story about the Ashe Juniper and why Texas has waged war against it.
The juniper tree, I struggle with even just the perception, that the juniper tree is this evil water-sucking plant, because to me it's clearly endemic to this landscape. It's a hallmark of the landscape.
So a lot of people believe that the Ashe Juniper tree or cedar tree is a water hog, and that it drinks way more water than an oak tree. And there was some sort of faulty research that said that it does that, and then they've done more in-depth research, and when you study the trees as a community and on average and in different locations and contexts, that's actually not true. They take about as much water as an oak tree.
When I think about the juniper tree, it reminds me of meeting an indigenous man out in the desert and him telling me that the sagebrush out there, basically there's a word for it that translated to something like the governor. And it was like the protector, it was like the regent of that area. And I think the same thing is true for the juniper tree.
I've grown up my whole life clearing cedar, and everywhere you clear them, the only thing that comes back is the Ashe juniper.
Many a tall tale, story, and myth surround this tree. They're often passed down from generation to generation, or from neighbor to neighbor. But to fully understand the story of the Ashe juniper, colloquially called cedars, we need to go back to the beginning of European colonization of Texas. When Europeans first arrived in the hill country, they encountered biodiverse old-growth forests with abundant pole mountain cedars up to 40 feet tall. These forests would stretch, in some cases, for miles. Most famous of these was the Colorado River breaks, which William Bray, a famed botanist at the University of Texas in the early 1900s, reported, "It is perhaps no exaggeration to estimate the area of these alone at 500 square miles."
Cedar groupings today are typically dense, treacherous, and menacing expanses of short, shrub-like cedar bushes. Old-growth cedar breaks would have been much more akin to old-growth forests we are more accustomed to elsewhere in the United States. The mountain cedars in these forests were much taller and grew in a much more tree-like pattern. And in these breaks, they were married with tall oaks, and together they formed canopies that were described as cathedral-like.
It's here where I'm sure many a Texan would clap back, claiming that cedars were confined to box canyons, that they're a non-native invasive species, or any numerous other legends and myths passed down through the generations.
However, here in the Balcones Canyon lands, almost 70,000 acres of cedar brake and cedar forest exist, stretching from the top of the hills like we're on now, down the hillsides and into the canyons below.
These trees and their kin that stretch across the hill country are descendants of junipers dating back to at least the first ice age, as evidenced by juniper pollen that's been discovered in previously sealed caves in the hill country.
It's estimated that up to 50% of the Texas hill country would have been a savanna-style landscape, where bison and other mammals would have controlled these native grasses and kept the soil system moving.
In the cedar breaks, large mammals such as bears and jaguars, yes, jaguars, roamed using the foliage as their perfect hunting grounds.
These old-growth cedars were incredibly valuable to the first settlers of the Texas frontier. In his 1963 book, Wimberley's Legacy, Willie Del Shaw wrote,
"The durable heart timber from the cedar breaks was used extensively by the early settlers of Wimberley. Cedar logs were hewn and used in building log houses and other buildings. As settlement in the hill country increased, these large cedars became even more valuable. Telegraph poles, house framing, and railroads were all built with the help of these abundant forests. The early hill country economy was built from the backbone of these old-growth trees."
So how did we go from extensive old-growth cedar breaks forests to the caliche-covered scrublands that we now associate with the Texas hill country?
Firstly, the rapid expansion of that economy led to mass clear-cutting and destruction of these forests and breaks. And from there, it only got worse.
Roy Benechek writes in his book, Adventures with a Texas Naturalist,
"Natural life in North America has been more profoundly affected by fencing than by any other of man's devices, ancient or modern. For it is the fence which has enabled him to multiply at will those species which minister to his wants while suppressing plants and animals which do not."
It was the introduction of fencing and grazing that provided the coup de grace following the mass clear-cutting of Ashe junipers.
And as we began introducing fences, livestock began grazing the same areas over and over again. Coupled with expanding clear-cutting of the old-growth cedar breaks, the hill country was dealt a devastating double punch. Endless clear-cutting and overgrazing stripped the cover of protective vegetation, exposing thin limestone karst soils. And with no larger foliage left to protect it, that soil would, and often still to this day, remains bare. The tide of mass industrialization swept the United States at the end of the 19th century, and with this wave swept away the topsoil and cedar breaks and forests that once defined the hill country.
What one must understand about the hill country geology is that it's a region unlike most in the United States, and one that the new arrivals to this land didn't fully understand.
Unlike many of the European and East Coast forests that could be regenerated and regrown within 50 years, the hill country features vastly more shallow topsoil. Burning, overgrazing, and overforesting leave this soil exposed to the harsh weather patterns of this region. The hill country sees extensive periods of drought followed by extensive periods of flooding, which for a shallow topsoil like ours is the ultimate death sentence. It is baked under the oppressive Texas summer sun, only to be washed away in seemingly biblical levels of rainfall soon thereafter, now to be lost forever. By the early 20th century, many of the cedar breaks were gone, and left behind was little more than scraggly, barren grazing land. That landscape is very much the same we find today in large parts of the hill country. So, this begs the question, if cedars used to form tall, large, and expansive trees, then why is the hill country covered with small, bushy expanses of shrub-like cedars?
And therein lies the crux of the story. We've missed the metaphorical forest for the trees, but also the literal forest for the trees.
The Ashe juniper is one of the few plants and essentially the only native tree that can actually grow in the depleted hill country soil, and caliche left behind after the unchecked human exploitation of that topsoil. Mountain cedars have been spreading as pioneering thickets, not forests, across this depleted and dead land, and work incredibly hard to build new life, most importantly, new soil. As mountain cedars spread, their dense canopies protect and help rebuild the soil. Their roots retain the soil and help increase the porosity of the underlying limestone. Combined with the cyclical shedding of its foliage and the erosion control of their roots, new soil begins to form and groundwaters increase and erosion decreases.
It's here, in this proverbial island oasis, that plants and wildlife will find new homes over time.
To demonstrate some of these concepts, I reached out to my friends at Symbiosis, Texas, who have worked with cedars on a daily basis for years.
So we're looking at an example of an Ashe Juniper tree or cedar tree acting as a nurse tree for this fragrant mimosa, which is a shrubby native tree. I believe it's leguminous, which means that it fixes nitrogen through a relationship with bacteria on its roots, so it helps add nitrogen to the soil. It's beautiful flowers, good for the pollinators. And because it does have these little thorns on it and it grows in sort of a shrubby thicket, birds and reptiles like to take shelter under these trees. So there's a really great aspect of biodiversity here that probably wouldn't be here without the cedar tree to build soil and act as a nurse tree. So when these are thick, they help keep the deer off of new things that they would want to eat. And if you look around, like right in a circle right around the juniper tree, there's duff and the ground is covered and there's more grass growing. And then there's an outer perimeter where it's much rockier. And so you can really see how these are adding organic matter and helping to stabilize and hold the soil against erosion. And then you start to get, there's a little oak tree right here. There's the fragrant mimosa. There's more of a bunch grass. I think this might be blue stem. And then there's little sedges. And so, yeah, this is just an example of the cedar tree doing good work. And it doesn't deserve to be demonized as much as it has been over the years.
So this is another great example of a nurse tree situation with the juniper trees. You know, anywhere where these beautiful, smooth, but peely bark madrone trees are, they will not grow, this guy as well as this guy, they will not grow unless they have that cedar fungal relationship. So, you know, just understand that if you're gonna clear your junipers, then you're gonna potentially not have the nurse tree that's going to allow for these beautiful madrones to inhabit your property. So, you know, especially for oak trees, let's say, a lot of folks in this Central Texas area like to park out their land to have it look like that oak savanna. Just consider that around that oak tree is a whole community of biodiversity that's supporting the livelihood of that oak tree. It's its community. So in there, you're going to have agarita, which has berberine, which is a strong antifungal, antibacterial, antiviral that we use in apothecaries. And there's also going to be juniper that's shading out those roots. So if you can, keep at least that southwest pie of cover on those oak tree roots so that it's not getting that blazing summer sun and stressing that tree. Because generally, if you park it out, clear every single thing except for the oak tree, you are setting that entire ecosystem up for oak wilt within the next 5 to 10 years. So just something to consider as we're clearing and managing land.
So you can actually see the Devil's Backbone right there. If you've ever driven over the Devil's Backbone Ridge, that's where it is. So we are at the very, very, very top of a watershed. And that means that there's no water flowing here from higher ground because we're at the top. And so one thing that's really interesting about the cedar trees, the Ashe Juniper trees, is they are condensing organic matter and carbon from the air and from the sun. And so they're bringing it up to the top of the hill. If you think about the energy it would take to take organic matter from, let's say, like a soil yard and put it in a dump truck, you're burning fossil fuel, bring it up to the top of the hill, you're burning fossil fuel. Or imagine doing that by hand with a wheelbarrow. Pushing a wheelbarrow full of carbon or soil up a hill would take so much energy. These trees are doing it voluntarily for free without spending that energy. They're sequestering carbon both into the soil and in their branches. And then the real tragedy is when people hear that, oh, you remove your cedar trees and the springs come back, and then what they do is they hire a bulldozer and they bulldoze it all into piles and they burn it. And you lose all of that, however many years it is, of carbon sequestration, and you release it all into the atmosphere very quickly. And you also create compaction, and you, in a lot of cases, you're gonna kill all of the little biodiversity trees and shrubs and forbs that are being nursed by the Ashe juniper. And then the rains come and it washes away all the duff and all the leaves and all of the topsoil that you do have. And essentially, you're just going to have to do it again in 10 or 20 years if you want to keep the cedar gone. So I think that's the worst thing you could possibly do. And we're going to show you guys some alternatives to that here.
So when we get a lot of landowners who have just pure juniper thickets like this, you can see it's difficult to move through. You can't see through it. So, one of the best options, instead of just clearing the whole thing, creating a bunch of erosion issues for yourself, is go ahead and get yourself a topo map or give us a call and let us help you put the placement of where you're going to cut, trim, use the cedar eater, limb them up and put them on brush berms. And then you can put strips on contour or slightly off contour in the keyline plan system, which is gently nudging water from the valley towards the ridge, which evenly hydrates the whole landscape. And then we can selectively clear paths. And then behind those paths, we can selectively replant in the more desirable trees in like a whip formation. Whips are just very small native trees or fruit trees. And then so we can acknowledge that, yes, we need to clear, and we need to acknowledge all the different functions that juniper is currently providing: soil building, water harvesting, mist gathering, fungal relationship creating. And so then we can more strategically design our clearing plan instead of just broad open, clear everything so that we have a beautiful view. And then we can kind of stage our clearing over the next few years if it's possible for us to do so.
Given enough time, these shrubby cedar stands will eventually birth larger, more upright cedars, and on an even longer time scale, in conjunction with the many trees that the cedars allow to grow, would form large cedar breaks.
First, I think important to reiterate, just move slowly, take a moment to sit underneath the juniper tree and try to, for some people this might be a little bit uncomfortable, but try to listen. The plants are all speaking to you, they're talking to you, and try to understand, am I doing this just because I am following some sort of cultural norm? Am I just doing this because I've been told this is what I need to do? Or can I really tell that there's a benefit in clearing this area a little bit more and cutting it up? Because sometimes you don't have to do anything, because the junipers might be in the process of establishing a hardwood forest for you. It just might be many hundreds of years past your time, your actual life. But sometimes you come in an area and it's like, okay, we're going to open this area up for access, for cattle, for many different reasons that I think are justifiable. And if you limb those lower branches, what you can then do is create what you see here, which is called a brush berm. And this brush berm is, you don't have to do it on contour, but how we do it is we'll get a laser level and we will flag out a contour line, which is basically a line that every point on that line is at the same elevation level. So when water hits it, it's hitting it at the same time, and it's sitting level as it hits this obstacle. So we're slowing water down as it moves through the landscape and controlling for erosion. And where erosion's happening uphill, where topsoil is being pulled off of the ground, it's going to get caught in this organic web of life. And slowly over time, it'll create a gentle berm. And that gentle berm is a seed bank. It is erosion control. It's habitat for insects, for birds, for other organisms that I don't even know about. And it's just a very clever way to keep all that energy, all that carbon that took 10, 20, 30 years to develop on the land on that landscape instead of burning it or hauling it off somewhere into a landfill, which is also pretty common. So this is just a very neat, clever way to protect erosion, do something with that organic matter. You can also chip it. As you can see behind us, there's lots of wood chips. That's going to add organic matter back into the soil as well, and set the stage for overall ecosystem health and water sequestration, which we all, I think, care about here in Central Texas, is making sure as much water stays and actually infiltrates into the landscape as possible.
Something that Chris mentions and is important to bring up is that clearing ash juniper is a totally understandable land management choice. But when we do so, we have to understand the role that the juniper plays in that system. If we remove it, we need to replace its functions. When clearing for grazing, native grasses, if allowed to grow to a healthy state, will fulfill many of those functions. However, these grasses must be rotationally grazed and managed properly. And if we don't, We just repeat the cycle of topsoil degradation, and likely the cedars that were removed will just come right back to take on the responsibilities that we aren't fulfilling.
All right, so when you are managing cedar and you're clearing it selectively, you end up with these giant brush piles. And so what do you do with all that brush? And if you put it all in a big pile, it'll knit together and it'll get hard to remove. And basically you're gonna need heavy equipment like a skid steer with a grapple bucket to get it out of there. So a couple different options you can do. One, you can make smaller brush piles if you have a wildlife tax exemption, which you can get if you already have an ag exemption. You can transition to wildlife. You can make brush piles, and that contributes to your tax exemption, and that's great for the birds and for the reptiles. You can build brush berms like we've done on this job site and we've talked about, or you can also mulch it, and the best way to do that is to use something like a hydro mulcher, hydraulically powered mulcher that mulches the trees in place, and to make sure that you work with a land clearing company with that equipment that understands how to do that selectively and doesn't just want to come in and mow everything down. So you want to make sure that they're going to look for maybe leaving the more mature cedar trees, make sure they don't take out some of the other biodiversity that exists among the cedar thickets that they've been cultivating as nurse trees.
So this mulch on the ground does a lot of things. So whenever we get these big Central Texas rains, if you have bare soil, bare stone, every drop of rain is going to be like a little atomic bomb explosion. It's going to explode any of that dust that's trying to build soil, and it's going to erode it straight off the land. So anytime that we can get some kind of mulch cover, even just a little bit, it gives us the ability to slow that rain and allow it to seep into the land. If you use a forestry mulcher, which is a great option instead of burning, make sure you're on site with them, because those machines are so powerful and so fast and so efficient at their job that they can clear a lot very quickly, and they might clear more than you want. So ideally, you're out there with eye pro and ear protection, pointing at this and pointing at that, and watch out for this madrone, and here's a little red oak, and you're just kind of pointing them, orchestrating their whole process while they're on the land. If you're going to pay them for the day of work or the 3 days of work, be there to make sure that they're getting it exactly where you want it, because they can clear cut your whole land without you being aware of it. No fault of theirs. So just make sure you're there to orchestrate the process when you pull in big machinery and you're working on your land. The next step is we inoculate these with spent fungal bags. So all of this woody material right here is inoculated with spent fungal blocks from one of our mushroom producers, Hi-Fi Mycology. And so all of this white mycelium is gonna just feast upon this buffet of lignin and carbon and wood as a primary decomposer. And what you see now is not what you're gonna see in springtime. It's gonna be a completely different, dark, rich, moving towards black, humus-filled, soil-rich medium. So that's where we can really get into the interesting parts of how does nature work at a fundamental level and utilize all of that knowledge that we've gleaned and put it to use with the juniper tree as the fundamental backbone that we're building life building forces off of.
So, what's the point of all of this? Why did I spend hours writing, researching, and shooting this film? Why should I care about this tree?
So we've all learned about the water cycle, 5th grade, 8th grade, whenever it was. We have evaporation, water goes into gas, it goes up into the sky, we get condensation into clouds, and then precipitation back onto the landscape. So that's the big water cycle. The small water cycle is evapotranspiration. Each tree, each blade of grass is evapotranspirating, which is basically exhaling in the morning through its little breathing stomata mouth parts. And in that exhalation, it's releasing small little particles into the vapor, into the sky. And as water, as precipitation, as condensation is moving over, it interacts with those little nuclei, those little charged nuclei that have been expired by the plant, and it allows more moisture to condense around those little charged nuclei and create clouds and precipitate more. So when we have cedar, juniper, or grasses, or any type of soil cover, that's releasing more gases, more charged nuclei into the local environment, and those are creating water. And so we have the big water cycle, which we're all familiar of, but we got to honor the small water cycle, which any type of growth on land, covering soil and photosynthesizing is also creating. And so that's why plants are creating soil, not just we treat the soil to grow more plants.
As humans, we naturally always try to find the simplest answers, regardless of the complexity of the issue. And for me, the cedar is an evergreen example of this innate human behavior. When we approach the proverbial root of the situation, we begin to understand that cedar is not the issue or a problem, and it is merely a symptom of a deeper lying issue, a soil and water issue. We, humans, have created a problem and nature has responded. And instead of introspection and the reflection to diagnose this issue, we have gone after the symptom, the Ashe Juniper. This is an issue that manifests itself in varying ways across the planet, and one that we, as humans, have dealt with since the invention of agriculture. It's likely not an issue that we will ever solve in our lifetimes. But what we can do is to allow ourselves to stop, reflect, and observe. And by doing this, we become better stewards of both our home and land, but also the future we shape for those who will come after us. The philosophical study of nature endeavors in the vicissitudes of phenomenon to connect the present with the past. Special thanks to Elizabeth McGreevy, author of Mountain Cedars Wanted Dead or Alive. Not only was her book a major source of both material and inspiration for this film, she herself was a resource at multiple points over the creation of it. In her book, she dives way deeper into all of the things discussed in the film, so if you want the full story, specifically the origin and validity of the numerous claims and tall tales around the Ashe Juniper, be sure to grab her book, link in below. Additionally, thanks to the team at Symbiosis as usual for sharing their knowledge, wisdom, and experience with me. And lastly, I've added numerous links to scientific sources and whatnot for many of the claims made in this video. But yeah, be sure to tell me why you think I'm wrong in the comments below. Bye!